The next presentation is going to be by Dr. Roger Pearman. He's the founder of Leadership Performance Systems. And kind of interestingly, too, when we had our conversation, part of what his conversation with you is going to be around how to build coaching capacity with your leaders. I mean, personally, I think this is a phenomenal topic. I don't know how many of you have really worked to help your managers and leaders be better coaches, but in my personal experience, it's been one of the single best things you can do in terms of investments of time is teaching your leaders and managers to be better coaches. So in any case, you know, again, I always ask people a little bit about themselves, and Roger told me, he says, I've got something kind of interesting, and I said, what's that? And he said, well, I've got a daughter who is serving in the Peace Corps and a son who is in the Marine Corps at the same time. So a real service-oriented family. So please help me welcome to the stage Roger Pearman. Roger?
Thank you. And good morning. It's a delight to be with you. I thank the event folks for inviting me and for MHS for sponsoring this particular conversation. In the journey that we're going to take this morning, I hope we're going to take a look at a number of things that I find to be absolutely critical in helping managers and leaders become more effective coaches in their particular setting. So let's make sure I can get this to go in the right direction. Here we go. My work over the last 40 years has really been about helping individuals have understanding about their the way their personality plays out in their leadership and work roles. As I've listened over the last day and yesterday and in other conversations, I thought how interesting that when I started doing things like writing books, how today I spend most of my time creating what I call drop-down insight opportunities, material electronically that people use in order to help them be more effective in their interactions with folks in their particular roles. One of the main ideas that I'd like to sort of offer you is that when it comes to effective leadership, I think very often in effective coaching, is that it's about learning increasing layers of discernment, finding where the boundaries are, identifying the foreground, the background, locating the information or the stuff, if you will. That's really important. And so in our conversation, there will be a number of ways in which I'm going to invite you to think about the kinds of things we can do to help leader managers who are in a coaching conversation pay attention in a way to refine their abilities at discernment. Now, this is a very popular framework that we see all over. And in the blue boxes, depending on which organization I have a chance to work with, there is this conversation about high potentials. Now, my work primarily, either in coaching executives or working with companies to develop training programs to help their managers become more effective coaches. I like to engage the organizations with the conversation about how they define high potential. And what I would share with you is that my observation is that there are four kinds of aspects to high potential. And I know each of you have perhaps your own opinion about this. But from the up-close and personal perspective, which as a coach, I've been able to watch certain patterns and trends over the years, is that one of the key elements, and we hear the word learning agility translated in pragmatic ways, it's when I ask a question like, tell me about 3 of the recent experiences you've had from which you've learned something that you use in your work today. A simple question, and yet a set of fascinating responses that tend to flow from getting folks engaged in a conversation about what you've learned and how you're using that learning. My next question is, how did you learn it? What I would observe is that learning agile people use more learning tactics more frequently, and often can be quite clear about the different strategies they've used in order to learn what they needed to learn in order to be effective in their particular role. A second factor I find with high potentials is around their time horizon. When I ask a question as a coach and I say, tell me about your long-term objectives, your long-term goals, either in your career or in your work, it's fascinating the number of people who will say, well, I don't really get a chance to think long-term. I think about today. If I can get through today, I consider that a good outcome. Then there are those who will say, well, actually, I often think about the decisions I'm making today and the implication it's going to have next year or the following year. And in fact, as I think about my career, I take a long-term look and try to look out over the next 10 to 15 years. So I observe that with those people who seem to naturally have conversation about a time horizon that exceeds this week, tend to have some other attributes, which is what we would associate with high potentials. A third factor I've noticed with high potentials has to do with the, if you will, the level of systems thinking they seem to have at their fingertips. They're individuals who, when they look at problems, they see problems in context to layers of systems and issues. The fourth factor, and this one is, I think, quite interesting, is that emotionally intelligent high potentials have a sort of accelerated path. We know when there is a problem with emotional intelligence, it's a decelerated path. If you take a look at any of the derailment literature, you see constantly that the number one issue that derails managers and executives is their inability to foster relationships, to build teams. You go down the list, and almost all of the matters that are listed related to problems in a career, or you follow a high potential and then they plateau, and you try to figure out what's going on, it's inevitably around what we would call their EQ issues. So in my experience as a coach, when I think about and I hear languaging around high potentials, I start looking for those particular aspects which seem to me to be very much a part of the high potential equation. Now, through the span of my career, like you, many of you, you've seen the environment change from one of my early coaching clients was a bank president, and he said, when I was hired and the boss said, do something, you do it. Today, when I say do something, people ask, why should I? He very much had that first mindset around the way things should operate, and he was having difficulty adapting to the changes. We've seen the language in the management literature change over the last number of years, and the fact is that now, and we heard it yesterday a number of times, the layers of complexity, the who's responding to whom, the criticality of relationships, and the ability to work with people in a broad range of settings is certainly highlighting the EQ question. Well, I like to know, since I'm in this field, when people are collecting data, and a particular institute of personnel and development, which surveyed 10,000 organizations, reported that in general, when you ask the question, who receives coaching in our organization, you can see the list is pretty significant, that coaching is very much a part of what's expected in the experience of folks in their particular leadership role. Then the next question is, who delivers the coaching? And I find this quite interesting. The coaching industry since 1995 to now has gone from a relatively mild, if you will, service industry to now, I think the most recent estimate is a $3.5–4 billion industry around the world. So the external coaching phenomena has been exponential in growth. The other day I was just curious to see how many different categories of coaching currently exist. And yet, when asked the question, who delivers coaching in your organization, the vast majority of people identify people internal to the organization, and overwhelmingly the expectation is that the line managers are going to do the coaching inside of the organization. So I have made it part of my passion to help those line managers achieve the things they need to do in order to be effective coaches. When asked what is coaching for, overwhelmingly in the survey they collected, the data showed that 78% of the coaching was related to individual performance. The rest of the kinds of issues and topics that are covered in coaching is of certainly no surprise to you, and the kinds of things that you would sort of expect to show up on a survey. Now, I was really quite taken with the study that indicated that overwhelmingly, when you look at it, 2/3 of the respondents to the notion of what is coaching for, it's about helping people perform. Now, when I approach a coaching interaction with a company and we're working on how to develop a coaching conversation within the organization, I have sort of a model that I use to help the organization understand what the territory is around coaching and how to help foster the kind of leadership coaching skills that are needed in the organization. Not much of this is going to be new to you. You've seen these kinds of models before. I just simply want to suggest that if you're going to develop a coaching training process inside of your organization, for all the reasons we know are important, these are touchstone areas that need to be a part of the way you set up the conversation and the coaching sort of expectations about what it is that people are actually doing when in fact they're trying to coach their employees. Now, we happen to be an alliance partner with Lominger Korn Ferry. I have been working with Mike Lombardo and Bob Eichinger for many years. And one of the things that we do, because again our focus is around the coaching equation, is using the architect, the leadership architect, we'll ask when we go into an organization to help identify what are the kinds of behaviors that you want in your leader coach. And then of course we collect data. We find out from the raters, if you will, how important are these attributes and also how effective are leader managers tending to display these qualities in order to be effective in their leader coach role. Now, I've simply put in red all of those competencies that fall below 3.5. In the world of psychometrics and especially the studies around 360 tools, there's an enormous amount of evidence that on average, on a 1 to 5 scale, when an individual starts getting scores below 3.5, there's likely some noise there that's worth paying attention to. So I highlighted in red the kinds of things that people say, yeah, it's really important, but not as effective as perhaps one might need to be in order to be an effective leader coach. So approachability, being compassionate, dealing with conflict, interpersonal savvy, listening, motivating, taking perspective, being an effective personal learner, having self-knowledge and understanding others, being the ones that folks are saying, yeah, really important, but we don't seem to see those particular behaviors as effectively as we might like. Well, we all know that behavior is the tip of the iceberg, or in this case, just sort of the top of the waterline. What I find is often really helpful is to invite coaches, leader coaches, to start thinking about their mindset. And one of the questions I'll ask them is, what is the difference between teaching and coaching? And the quotes I'm using today actually pretty much come from a recent program I did in India with 24 CEOs from India and Africa, in which they're wanting to understand what a coaching conversation might be like in their organizations. And so when asked, what's the difference between teaching and counseling, and what does it mean to mentor, and then what is coaching all about, these are actually the most typical answers that I will get. Now, one of the reasons why I want leader, manager, coaches to sort of think about their definition is your mindset around coaching permeates every choice you make in the interactions you have. And so I like to get them to refine their thinking about coaching. And you know what I'm about to say is true. You've seen it many times yourself. They can conceptually articulate this is what coaching is. But they behave like teachers and counselors. When they think about doing coaching, they really think about it mostly as giving you the instructions of what you need to do in order to be effective in your work. Now, I've coached you, go do it. And yet, when asked what's going to make for effective coaching, or when you've had an effective coach, what made it effective, they'll talk about a relationship where you're sort of getting a chance to check out things and explore things. And they can give a lot of verbal description to what coaching is. But the very moment I put them in a lab to practice coaching, they move right to giving direction, instruction. And then, of course, when I give them the feedback and they quickly say, no, that's not what I did, and I say, well, let's look at the videotape, they immediately say, how did you change the videotape? I received this picture from a manager who was in a coaching program, and what he said to me was, he said, you know, as I'm exploring this notion of building a coaching relationship, it sort of feels like you're asking me to get in a basket and float with people to some unknown location, and that we have to figure out how to manage this balloon. And then underneath he said, and I absolutely hate this, because I want to have more control and more direction on where we're going. And that was an honest and interesting interaction that we were able to have about how do we get in a coaching relationship where, in fact, we may have an idea of the destination, but if we're going to be in a coaching conversation, we have to be open to the notion that indeed it may go in a direction that we hadn't initially thought or intended. Well, as I thought about you today, and I thought about this conversation with you, I decided to do some research. I wanted to know, in juried articles, meaning research that was presented, evaluated by an independent panel in an anonymous way, so it had to pass a variety of professional tests. I wanted to know, how has this coaching topic evolved over time within organizations? And I discovered that prior to 2000, there were only 63 juried research articles published in such things as the Journal of Personnel, IO Psychology, things of that nature. After 2000, my last count was 620 juried articles around the notion of coaching, and especially coaching inside of organizations, which gives us a real hint about how important this topic continues to be. So this is what was said in 1958. The researcher concluded that the art of coaching is something that men will never learn and others do not need to be taught. In 1964, although good coaching is basic to managerial productivity, most organizations have difficulty getting their managers to be effective coaches. In 97, coaching captures the skills that enable people to shift their thinking from control and prescription to empowering others. So I guess we've made a change in our lens that maybe it is teachable. Maybe, in fact, people can learn to be effective leader coaches. This particular piece was a big research piece that was in IO Psych. And then in January, in working in Assurant Solutions, much to my delight, the president of Assurant wanted to talk to the senior leadership group who was in this particular training program. And this is what he said. He said our managers must learn to be effective leader coaches, or our ability to grow the talent needed to achieve our business objectives will fail. It is a financial imperative that we learn to be effective coaches to harness the capabilities that we've worked so hard to recruit and maintain. I, of course, wanted to stand up and shout, yes. Thank you for that endorsement, that indeed learning to be effective leader coaches is important. Well, then, of course, the natural question is, well, gee, we know what the skills are, we know what the behaviors are, what are the resistors? And when asked, leaders, managers will often say, well, time is an issue. Another group will say, well, I'm not sure the organization really supports this, learning to be a leader, effective leader coach. About 10% will say skill. Some will say resources. But the number one reason that people will talk about and disclose that they have problems moving into that coaching space is dealing with emotions. Because when I'm coaching and I'm really having to work with a person and establish a relationship and connection with a person, there might be some emotions that bubble up that I'm not quite sure I know how to handle. Well, that leads me to think about this, that in fact, maybe what we need to do is to take a deeper look at the way we're thinking about emotions and to have a deeper understanding of how we can utilize research on emotions in teaching how folks to be effective leader coaches. Now, if you follow those of us who are really interested in what are the researchers saying about development, what does the evidence tell us about development, there seems to be three lines of reasoning that you find in a lot of the research, and perhaps many of you follow these discussions as well. One line of reasoning is that development is about helping people identify their capabilities and supporting them so that they can become effective in the roles that they're in. Another line of research is all around adding skills, making sure that people can add to the range of skills that they have in order to be effective. A newer line of thinking is referred to as vertical development, and it's the notion of shifting perspective and the utilization of self-management for the purpose of being more of an author of your own circumstances. There's a way of thinking about what is needed to help people move into the leader coaching space. And so it is both skill and mindset. And what I would like to suggest to you as an analogy is the following. That if we're trying to change mindset, that means we are really radically trying to change perspective. And so what I want to do is simply make the following example an analogy. I have on the screen what is considered to be, by the most reputable map company in the world, what the map of the world looks like. And that's what you and I were taught. When we look at those proportions, it's the way when we think of the map of the world, we see it. Yesterday, I counted 4 times. There were maps of the world put up at different presentations which had the same sort of layout. I'm willing to bet that many of you will find this slide a surprise. The true size of Africa. The true size of Africa includes the entire territory of the United States, China, India, Japan, all of Europe, and the United Kingdom. Most people, when they think of the world, hardly think of Africa of having that size. The first time I ran into this image was several years ago in a museum, and I stood there absolutely aghast that I have gone through my entire adult life with a certain idea of what the true size of Africa is. And I was so astonished, I called several people at the university and said, I just saw this picture, I don't believe it. Tell me this, if this is true. And the answer came back, indeed it is. My perspective of the true size of Africa has been forever changed as a result of a set of new pieces of information. And I think of mindset shifts as that kind of shift. Once you take in a new lens or a new perspective, in fact, you really do begin to see the world, in this case, see Africa, very differently. I had a moment of sort of astonishment, and so this picture captures it for me. You know, the sun behind the clouds, and it's like, how could this be? All these years and not know. So the skills we have a good idea on, I mean, at least people tell us these are the things we need, and we just looked at that list. So what else might we do to help leader managers make the kind of shift they need to make in order to be effective leader coaches? So I'm going to ask you to participate in a little exercise. At all your tables, underneath the little booklet that says Emotions and Leadership, or close to it, is a little piece of paper that says, please do not open until instructed to do so. So now you're being instructed to do so. If you would please, quietly to yourself. The worksheet has 2 parts. Part 1 asks you to look at some attributes, and Part 2 asks you to make some judgments. So without talking with your learning partners next door, take just a moment and complete both parts of the assignment. All right, let's find out how we are in our overall impression of our candidate here. How many of you felt this person is likely to be generous? So, generous here, all right. What about shrewd? We got a nice thread of shrewd to the room. Okay, what about unhappy? Got a little group of unhappy here. What about humorless? Got some humorless weight over here. What about sociable? Oh, so pretty sociable on this side of the room. That's kind of nice. What about popular? So we're popular, we're social, popular, generous, and happy on this side of the room. What about ruthless? No ruthless, 1 or 2 over here, but overwhelmingly ruthless on this side of the room. That's interesting. What about serious? Everybody thinks this person's serious. Okay, what about restrained? Most folks feel restrained. Self-centered. Few here, overwhelmingly here, cast votes there, self-centered. What about hard-headed? Got that spread out over the room. What about honest? Most folks feel honest. So it seemed as though we had a bit of a difference. Some folks seem to think, in this side of the room, some less than attractive qualities. In this side of the room, overwhelmingly, some pretty attractive qualities. Now, intelligent, skillful, practical, industrious, cautious, and determined are really attributes we typically see. But one side of the room had the word cold, and one side of the room had the word warm. It's quite interesting when I invite a group of managers to go through this experience, and we talk about how powerful warm is and what a difference warm makes. But you can have all of these remarkable qualities, being intelligent, industrious, being a determined person who's going to make things happen and get results. But when it comes to whether or not you're cold or warm, a whole cascade of additional attributes get attached to it. And I'll tell you just a quick little story. I've had the privilege for the last 5 years of working with the senior team at Ford Motor Company. And if you have ever heard an Alan Mulally story, you probably heard an Alan Mulally story that goes something like this. Whenever he has an opportunity, Alan Mulally will tell you, and I have seen him do it many, many times, when he starts a meeting, he will say, "Let us remember, we are here on this earth to be loved and to love. And in that frame of reference, let's talk about how to make this business successful." One of the first things he did when he had all the senior management team meet with the dealerships is that they stood and said to the dealerships, thousands of dealers who came to their dealership meeting, "We love you, and your partnership is essential for us to be successful." Now, that may all sound gimmicky to you, but I'd like for you to remember that when Alan Mulally was asked to be president of Ford Motor Company, Bill Ford had already told the attorneys to start working on the bankruptcy papers because they had calculated there were 6 months left before they would be bankrupt. Today, Ford Motor Company has some billions in the bank. They are about to open their second plant in China, the second plant in China that will produce 1 million cars a year. Alan Mulally's orientation toward all of the management folk that I've seen is what I would consider a really far way to go compared to what I've seen with a lot of executives. But he insists on a conversation with people in which he begins, and every single time I've ever seen him start a conversation, he says, "We have a lot of business to do, but what I want to know first is, what can I do to enrich your life today?" And he gets into that space, sharing some of his own personal journey and helping individuals. And he actively supports the notion of being firm but coaching-oriented in the ways in which the organization is expected to behave. It has translated into an amazing business story. In a recent meeting with a bunch of employees, in one of the plants, an employee stood up and said, "Mr. Ford," to Bill Ford, "Mr. Ford, would you please figure out a way to keep Alan Mulally here forever?" Numbers of folks have looked at this issue of what is the connection between warmth and effectiveness. In the last year or two, we've seen the Harvard Business Review do a variety of articles on is it better to be loved or feared, was one of the article topics. They've done a number of articles on fostering the trusting relationship. Inevitably, it comes around to how, in fact, people are communicating both the competence and the warmth of what I call positive regard. Now, this is a skill issue, just like getting folks to think about what does it mean to be a coach. getting folks into this space to start thinking about what does it mean to be a person who's approachable? What does it mean to be a person who communicates positive regard, to help create the kind of psychological space necessary in order for a coaching conversation to occur that ultimately will be effective? The whole language around emotional intelligence has changed over the last 30 years. The very first real EQ research piece that was ever done was done by Charles Darwin. He wrote a book entitled The Expression of Emotions in Animals and Humans. And it was an absolutely brilliant capsulization of basic emotions and how they play out in the relationships of communities and what enables them to be successful. We've seen an acceleration in the research on emotions, especially in the last number of years, that we're able to get a handle on neurological aspects of emotional energies. I've been cataloging now for the last 25 years the research on emotional intelligence and all the disciplines that I can tap into. And it seems to me the true Africa of emotional intelligence includes a lot of research on what's referred to as emotional literacy. And that means understanding the information in emotions. As a gift to you, you will see on the tables there is a booklet you can take with you entitled Leadership and Emotions. That booklet is entitled to help managers really get at the real basic understanding of what do emotions mean. There's a whole bunch of research on what are considered emotional abilities. If you've ever seen the Mesquite instrument, which gives you, for example, pictures of people's faces and you're asked to identify the emotion in the face, is trying to tap into the kind of discernment you have around emotional energies. What we now know is that there's a whole range of consequences around personality and emotional responses. Now, it so happens that when it comes to the behaviors that matter in this territory, way back in the 90s, I started using a tool called the Baron EQI. The Baron was a tool that tapped into those behaviors, not the entire universe of behaviors, but those behaviors that really are essential to getting a handle on how you express yourself, how your emotional energies are displayed, how it influences your problem solving, how it helps you enhance your stress hardiness, all of which are critical to the conversation. I use this tool in the leadership coaching stuff that I do, and I use both a booklet like the one I'm giving you to help anchor folks in the idea, the very basic idea, that emotion is in the wiring. In fact, we know that the way to get folks to sort of get rid of the myth around emotions is to help them understand that when a person is angry, anger is a biological, neurological event that's the same whether you are in Atlanta, Georgia, or Beijing. Human beings, when they get angry, there is the same thing that's going on, and there's information under that anger that you can learn as a leader manager to work with. One of the exercises in the book that I use a lot is an exercise, just so you know, on page 37 of the booklet, is around emotional hijacking and emotional comfort. And almost always when I get a group of managers to do this, there are 4 patterns that show up. There are managers who will say, I get hot under the collar when things are inefficient and inaccurate. When folks are overly focused on concepts and theories and just really not on what we should be focused on right now. Another pattern is around the notion of I get really irritated with a lot of abstractions and other people's impatience. You'll often hear other folks talk about getting upset when they find that people are perpetually sort of random in their discussions and imprecise and apparently not very competent at the thing they're trying to talk about. Well, it's no surprise to you that when you look at the two kinds of prompters and the kinds of irritants, that often the very thing that is a source of comfort for one, that is to say, I like to have things move with the flow, really ticks off the ones who like to have a well-organized schedule. And so we get into the conversation about how do we work together in a space where our needs for comfort can be at odds. And what are the impacts of that tension that's going on all the time in our working together? One of the pieces that I remind everybody is every single one of us is wired, underneath all of our behavior, we are wired to increase pleasure, reduce pain, and find an efficient path. And as a result, I'm naturally going to be inclined to go, if I'm a person who likes structure and order, I'm going there. And it's painful to be in a situation where the meeting seems to be disorganized, people want to have open-ended questions, oh my goodness, we're going to have brainstorming, you got to be kidding. And that just elevates the cortisol levels inside their system. And when we get into this discussion, we can have a real discussion about how these daily things tap into our emotional energies and how they impact how we do these things here and how, in fact, we interact and develop our coaching relationships. Now, with this model, and like you, I believe in the 70-20-10 system of development. And so whenever I'm helping leader coaches become more effective and to really tap into how to manage those emotions in productive ways, it is not only about getting feedback around their emotional intelligence, but it's also about some assignments or tasks they may take on to help them get in touch with some of those things that will accelerate their ability to have the kind of coaching conversations that they need to have. My primary goal is to suggest to you, in a big way, coaching as a way of growing, dealing with, and effectively managing talent is a worldwide phenomenon. I am absolutely astonished if someone had said to me 10 years ago that I would be going around the globe helping companies all over the world talk about creating a coaching conversation and how to help their leader managers become more effective coaches. I would have said, oh well, in somebody's dream. But this year, between India and China, Australia, Germany, the United Kingdom, there are companies eager to understand how can we create those conversations that help us to do, as the president of Assurance said, maximize the talent we work so hard to recruit and need for our financial success. Thank you for your time and your attention.